Check, 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 check. Test.
All right, I think it's working now. Let's get going. Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for appearing before this committee. I understand that it was 30 years ago this week that you were first nominated to a public sector role as a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. It's a noteworthy record of service. I congratulate you, and I appreciate your willingness to answer our members' questions today. You've joined the recent chorus of economists who acknowledge that it was a mistake to call inflation, quote, transitory. But it's worth noting the fundamental mistake, President Biden's reckless tax and spend policies that have sent the cost of living skyrocketing almost 20% since he took office. Families pay more today for pretty much everything than the day Joe Biden was sworn into office. Real wages are almost 4% lower than when he became president. The Federal Reserve has hiked borrowing rates to try to control inflation. Mortgage payments for the median price new home are now nearly $1,200 higher per month. Prices at the store are up. The cost of a gallon of gas is roughly 50% higher today than when President Biden took office. These are the facts. This is the reality that American families are living in President Biden's economy. Instead of allowing families hit by these high prices to keep more of their hard-earned money, President Biden wants the highest tax increase on families and small businesses in American history. Last week, President Biden called for the Trump tax cuts to expire, promising, quote, "If I'm reelected, it's going to stay expired." So President Biden's plan is for the average family of four making $75,000 to pay an extra $1,500 to the IRS each year. President Biden's promise is that the child tax credit will be slashed in half. President Biden's promise is that small businesses will face a 43.4% tax rate. This will all happen when the Trump tax cuts all expire under his watch. Basic facts. President Biden's promise is that family farms will be forced to sell off to big corporations to pay the death tax. In his latest budget, President Biden continues breaking his promise to not raise taxes on families making less than $400,000. Under the president's plan, seniors will see more of their life savings captured by the federal government. Small businesses will be taxed on their sweat equity and face tax rates approaching 50%. Energy producers will pay more, weakening America's energy independence. Madam Secretary, your own department's data shows that millions of Americans earning less than $400,000 will end up paying a portion of your proposed business tax increases. That's on top of the new audits that will be coming from the IRS, which you conceded in this committee last year. Over 90% of those audits will fall on middle-class earners and small businesses. To add insult to injury, under one-party rule, Democrats spent billions of taxpayer dollars on welfare for the wealthy and well-connected. They gave the wealthy tax credits for leasing or buying luxury electric vehicles, while working families got higher prices from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Under that same law, the Biden administration is sending billions of taxpayer dollars to Chinese companies tied to their communist government, all in the name of climate change. China is an adversarial nation spreading its influence around the world at the expense of American workers and producers. America should be standing up to China's unfair practices, not using tax dollars to make us even more dependent on China. The record of the 2017 Trump tax cuts could not be more different than the policies of this administration. The Congressional Budget Office found that after the law went into effect, the share of taxes paid by the top 1% of households increased, while the burden falling on lower income earners decreased. Real median household income increased by $5,000, a bigger gain than the prior 8 years combined. The officially reported poverty rate dropped to its lowest level in U.S. history, and Black and Hispanic unemployment reached historic lows. We reversed the decades-long trend of American companies picking up and moving their jobs, factories, and money overseas. Beyond our borders, the Biden administration has adopted a posture of surrender and retreat. The OECD global tax deal the administration is trying to negotiate would surrender America's tax revenue and jobs to foreign countries. Congress writes the laws, not bureaucrats negotiating behind closed doors. This deal has no path forward in this Congress. I hope today we can get some answers on why President Biden insists on tax hikes for working families, while the wealthy and well-connected receive cash handouts for their Green New Deal spending. Thank you for appearing today, and I look forward to our testimony. I now recognize the Ranking Member Nill for his opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, we're honored to have you in our presence today. We also want to highlight what has been a remarkable career. Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and a successor to Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. We're honored by your presence. Your team has been hard at work electrifying our nation, ushering in a new era at the IRS, and implementing Joe Biden's record-breaking economic agenda, all with the American people at the center of the work. Even the Wall Street Journal recently noted that our economy is the envy of the world. It's a well-deserved recognition for an administration that has created 15 million jobs, spurred a small business boom, and rebuilt an economy from the bottom up, the middle out, and breaking record after record. 4 years ago, this success was unimaginable, and it certainly was never guaranteed. Millions were without a job at no fault of their own. The grocery shelves were bare, and we had no answers for the mysterious virus taking the country by storm. And then President Joe Biden took office, returning our nation to one of science, sensibility, and for sure, stability. Starting with the American Rescue Plan and most recently with the Inflation Reduction Act, which came from this committee, Democrats' legislative successes have helped to transform the nation. We are bringing down health care and household energy costs. The clean energy economy has created over 270,000 jobs, and everywhere you travel, you can tell that infrastructure projects are underway across the country. Thanks to our multi-year investment, the Internal Revenue Service has had another outstanding filing season. I'm pleased with how in such a short order the agency has stood up to secure a way to file tax forms. I know many folks in the Commonwealth were able to use this program to ease their filing experience this year, including a state senator who mentioned it to me yesterday. And after years of underfunding at the hands of our Republican colleagues through their budget cuts, returns are being processed faster, more Americans are getting the service they deserve, and already $500 million in taxes owed from very wealthy people have been recovered. Looking ahead, the President's budget supercharges this progress and will finish the job for our people. The President's budget ensures that they have the supports necessary to not only fully participate in our workforce, but also to raise families and care for loved ones as we witness wages going up, and the responsibility that we have to hold the well-connected accountable. Amid all of this success, our colleagues on the other side have had difficulties trying to use their gavels for the work of the American people. The amount of time that has been wasted in this Congress on chaos, conspiracies, impeachments, and we have been fielding questions about this expiration of their tax scam for next year. There are still over 8 months left in this Congress and many more until these provisions expire, but it seems as though legislative opportunity is well already being considered by the Congress. I've seen their former leader calling for the devaluation of the dollar, stunting, and even in some cases repealing much of our legislative progress in the name of politics. It is deeply unpopular, and it puts the health of our economy and countless paychecks on the line. While we expand what's possible and build the economy of the future, our colleagues plot the next round of trickle-down economics with another round of tax cuts for the wealthy. I didn't ever believe that advisors to the former president would be suggesting that we manipulate our currency or we subtract from the independence of the Federal Reserve Board that is now has a chairman who is a Republican. This is unheard of, that these sorts of our economy would be jousted with in the coming months. I've said it before, and let me say it once more. The majority is a threat to the health and economic security of our American people. Time to get past the chaos, time to get past the conspiracies, and get on with our work. We look forward to hearing you as you set the record straight, and pleased that you are joining us again. Let me yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. Today's sole witness is United States Secretary of the Treasury, Ms. Janet Yellen. The committee has received your written testimony, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. Secretary Yellen, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify. The Biden administration has driven an historic economic recovery over the past 3 years. GDP growth has been strong, growing 3% over the past 4 quarters. Inflation has decreased significantly since its peak, though we have more work to do. The labor market is also remarkably healthy, with the unemployment rate below 4% for the longest stretch in over 50 years. Real wages and household median wealth have increased since before the pandemic, and families are putting their additional income and accumulated savings back into the economy. Consumer sentiment is up 21% from 1 year ago. President Biden and I are taking additional actions to bring down the costs of key household expenses like energy, prescription drugs, and housing. We're also focused on expanding our economy's capacity to create good jobs while reducing the deficit. As we implement the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, we're creating economic opportunity for Americans across the country, including those without college degrees and in communities that had historically been overlooked or left behind. Companies have announced over $675 billion in clean energy and manufacturing investments since the start of this administration, some of which I've gotten the opportunity to see firsthand. The modernization of the Internal Revenue Service, made possible by the IRA and discretionary appropriations, has enabled us to combat tax evasion by the wealthiest Americans that costs our country over $150 billion a year. And it's made it easier for taxpayers to file their taxes and get the credits they're owed. We met or exceeded all the goals we set out for this filing season, including reaching an 88% level of service, saving taxpayers over 1.4 million hours of hold time, and providing an additional 11,000 hours of in-person assistance compared to last year. We also successfully launched the Direct File pilot program, an easy, free, and secure way to file taxes on a computer or mobile device with over 140,000 accepted returns in the first year. The President's budget proposes additional investments to lower costs for workers and families and strengthen our economy while reducing the deficit, including making permanent the expansion of tax credits for health insurance premiums enacted in the American Rescue Plan and extended in the IRA, and expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit, and Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. These proposals would help make health care more affordable, reduce child poverty, and give working families more breathing room in their household budgets. We can make these investments while reducing the deficit by $3 trillion over a decade through a combination of smart savings and tax proposals. President Biden and I have proposed implementing a billionaire minimum tax so that the top 0.01% pay their fair share, raising the tax on corporate stock buybacks to encourage businesses to reinvest profits in their workers and grow their companies, and closing estate and gift tax loopholes that allow wealthy Americans to pay less than they would otherwise owe. As a whole, the President's budget will enable us to address costs that families face right now and to bolster our country's economic strength for the years ahead. I'll now be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session. Madam Secretary, in all four of President Biden's budgets, he plans to hit middle-class families with a multi-trillion-dollar tax increase starting in 2026. He has promised to let the Trump tax cuts expire. Isn't it true that President Biden is promising a $1,500 tax hike on a family of four earning less than $75,000 by that action?
The President has been very clear that no family earning less than $400,000 will face a tax hike. He's not proposed such a thing since he took office, and he's not proposing to allow that to happen when parts of TCJA expire.
So when you testified at the Finance Committee last month, you said, quote, "The president does not have a plan to address the coming tax hikes." That was at the Senate Finance Committee last month. Isn't it true that without a plan, the president would slash the child tax credit in half, which means parents lose $1,000 from their pocketbooks for each child each year?
The president has principles that will guide his negotiations with Congress over how to handle this. And his principles, has made clear that he opposes increasing taxes on people earning less than $400,000. He supports cutting taxes for working people and families with children to give them more breathing room.
Madam Secretary, does that mean that he will support the child tax credit to be made permanent at $2,000 that was put in the Trump tax cuts? Would the president support that? Because that affects working families.
The president has proposed in his most recent budget expanding the child tax credit and has supported the Wyden-Smith legislation that would increase the child tax credit now as well.
Would you say that that it would be true that leaving the Trump tax cuts expired means President Biden would roll back Republicans' guaranteed deduction, resulting in a tax increase of $3,373 for a family earning less than $75,000?
What I said, what the president has clearly articulated, is that no family earning under $400,000 will see their taxes go up in any set of proposals that the president is willing to.
So I appreciate that. We have looked at every budget that has been presented, and you have called for the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts. But there is no plan, as you testified before the Senate Finance Committee, saying that the president has no plan in regards to how to make sure there's no tax increases less than $400,000. I would love and welcome, and I think the American people would welcome, a plan from the president. In fact, he loves to interject in all kinds of policies. I would think he would want to there. In testimony before the committee, former Senator Phil Gramm called the Biden administration's decision to cut out Congress and unilaterally negotiate a tax deal with bureaucrats in Europe, quote, the greatest abuse of the Constitution of the United States, close quote, was Senator Phil Gramm's comment when he testified here. Each of the Biden administration's failures at the OECD can be traced to its decision to act unilaterally and without Congress. Will you commit to reject any OECD profit reallocation plan that disproportionately impacts American companies or allow U.S. tax revenues to be stolen away by foreign governments?
Well, let me say that the administration, the Biden administration, has worked very closely with Congress to inform and get input on Congress's priorities to guide these negotiations over the last 3.5 years, and will continue to do that. And I strongly believe that the Pillar 2 agreement that's been reached is very much in support of goals that are good for this country. The United States has been the only country until this agreement was signed to impose a tax on the overseas profits of its multinationals. And what this agreement secured is that all countries now will tax the profits of their multinational companies, which creates a level playing field for American companies and will stop the race to the bottom. And the United States will benefit by adopting the minimum tax that's consistent with
So,
the
Secretary
Pillar 2 agreement.
Yellen, the communication from the very first time we ever had a conversation, I raised the issue, for example, of the research and development tax credit not being accounted for during OECD, but direct government subsidies of the Chinese Communist Party gets much more credit than our research and development tax credit. You said that you've worked with Congress. We've been raising that from day one. We've been providing how detrimental that would be to U.S. companies by empowering the Chinese, which you have visited that country several times in your tenure, which has empowered them, but you've done nothing in regards to that.
I'm sorry, but we have.
What have you done?
We are negotiating with other countries right now to try to get favorable treatment for the R&D tax credit, and I'm hopeful that these negotiations will be successful. And I would point out that other tax credits, including the green tax credits and credits affecting the low-income housing tax credit, have been codified as continuing under Pillar 2.
So I'll just reiterate again our concern with almost $200 billion leaving American companies and going to foreign nations under the plan that this administration negotiated with Europeans, that we are adamantly opposed to that. The Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act that was supposed to prevent electric vehicle tax credits from going to foreign entities of concern in China and adversarial nations, but Treasury has created multiple loopholes that will send American taxpayer dollars to Chinese billionaires and Chinese manufacturers. Isn't it true that the foreign entity of concern rules written by your Treasury Department are more China favorable than the same foreign entity of concern standards from Biden's Commerce Department for semiconductors?
I believe that they're similar. These are very strong restrictions that, beginning this year and then continuing next year, preclude companies from receiving the $7,500 credit if this year they contain battery components that are have originated in a foreign entity of concern. And next year it will affect critical minerals and processing. We've worked very closely with the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce. It has been an interagency work to formulate these FIAC rules in a way that will certainly restrict China from profiting from the tax credit.
I think it's pretty clear that Treasury's version of these rules would allow Chinese billionaires to receive hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, as confirmed by the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. So in response to this committee, we recently passed the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America Act, led by Congresswoman Carol Miller, which would close those egregious loopholes and protect the American taxpayer. Treasury must do a better job of pushing back against our foreign adversaries. I now recognize the ranking member for questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Great job on China. You were firm, you were very strong, very assertive. IRA has worked. How about the harmonization of international tax rates so people don't seek the lowest tax jurisdiction, even though that's not where profits have been earned? Good work on the CHIPS Act. Really good work on the infrastructure bill, certainly the American Rescue Package. This is a great story for us to tell. So I want to give you some time to talk, Madam Secretary. Implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act is really important. Let me give you a couple of minutes to talk about that.
Well, let me just start by saying that although there's still more work to do, we've made tremendous progress implementing it. We have completed more than 60 guidance projects, and these are all on critical and complex issues, and we've been focused on getting the issues right. This involves collaboration with the Department of Energy, with EPA, and other experts to make sure that we're implementing the law effectively and as intended. It's also tremendously important, the impact that the IRA clean energy credits are having. We can see that they're catalyzing hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in cutting-edge clean energy technology and strengthening our supply chains, and at the same time lowering emissions in line with our climate goals and creating good jobs across the country, and particularly in parts of the country that really have not seen a lot of burst of economic activity. Treasury has been doing research on the impact of the Act, and what we find is that investment is especially strong in communities that have not seen a lot of investment, that have lower income and a smaller fraction of college-educated workers. So this is making a huge difference. The response has been enormous, and I've had the privilege of seeing many of the projects that are being spurred, as well as training that's taking place. I've had the privilege of visiting many workforce training programs that have been started to give our workers the skills to fill the good, high-wage jobs that are being created by this IRA.
Thanks. And could you speak to labor participation rates?
Yes. Labor force participation rates actually have moved up substantially. For adult workers, male and female, they've now exceeded the where they were pre-pandemic. They're moved up a great deal, and overall have moved up as well. And there is a downward trend that we see in labor force participation due to demographics, but this is really offsetting that. And this means not only more people working, and also in response to higher real or inflation-adjusted wages, it also alleviates supply constraints, and it's one of the factors that's enabled our economy to grow last year, for example, at 3%, and to create more than 200,000 jobs a month on a consistent basis.
9 million jobs every day in America go unanswered, as we know, and that's part of the skills alignment that you've just spoken to. Better job for all of us is required, perhaps through community colleges. But just as I close out, and I thank you for your testimony, I also want to point out something else. Everybody on this committee during my time objected to Chinese efforts to manipulate currency. So hearing now that the former administration is talking about the idea that they might manipulate currency, they might threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve Board. I never thought the day would come when it would be Democrats standing up for the independence of the Federal Reserve Board before our Republican colleagues. And consistently, both parties stood up against Chinese currency manipulation, and you were a very remarkable part of that. So we thank you for your testimony. Delighted you're here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I now recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. We appreciate your service. A lot of us have had an opportunity to work with you over the years. I want to touch on two things and have a little bit of a conversation. IMF came out a couple of days ago with a report. They're very concerned about where we're at financially. My background before I got here, 30 years in business, a lot of entities, basically hundreds and hundreds of balance sheets and income statements. I'm very concerned as well, because at some point, 49 out of 50 governors have to balance the budget. You can't continue down this road. Now, they're concerned because our deficit this year went from 1.4 trillion last year to 1.7. Interest on the debt, as you know, is close to $1 trillion. I've been here long enough, not quite 20 years, but been here long enough to clearly know that in the last 20 years, it's over $20 trillion in debt. Now, there's a lot of finger pointing going on, but we need to find a way to work together. It's got to be dealt with at some point. I know you've laid something out, but I've heard these stories, not so much from you, but others, about pretty pictures down the road. But I look around the room here, and I have 10 grandkids, and I look around the room, there's a lot of kids in here under 30. And we're spending their money, and we got to get very real about it. If you're in the state of Florida, one thing they have to do is pass a balanced budget amendment. That's the only thing they have to do, but they have to do that. And by the way, 49 out of 50 governors have to do the same thing. So I guess I ask you, what's your feeling about the IMF and their report a couple of days ago where they're very concerned about where we're at financially and where we're going?
Well, I would say I'm not terribly concerned about where we are, but I do have concern about where we're going unless we undertake some significant steps to reduce the budget deficit. And if you look at the president's 2025 budget, you'll see that he's proposed $3 trillion in measures to reduce the deficit over the next decade. I think that's important.
Let me ask you, Madam
what
Secretary.
it does is it keeps a key metric of the burden of the debt, which is real net interest that we have to pay on the debt.
I'm limited on my time. I want to get to this other question. You've talked about nobody paying any taxes above 400. I was chairman of the Florida Chamber, 130,000 businesses in the chamber, and I'd say 95% were pass-through entities. You're talking about letting that sunset. So what that means, so you understand, if someone's got 200-300 employees or 50 employees, you could very well be at 53%, 54% taxes all in, because the pass-through rate would go back to 39.6. There's a 3.2, and then if you look at states, I hate to say it, California and New York and some of the other states are great states, but they have another 10, 15% tax on top of it. So pass-through entities could very well, and then you're looking to get rid of 199A, could very well be north of 50%. And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the president is committed to ensuring that no family, including those with pass-through businesses making under $400,000, would see their tax increase. But he does believe, for the sake of tax fairness, that it is appropriate for
Well,
wealthy
let me just show you.
individuals
I've
and
been in the real-
corporations to pay more.
I've been in the real world in terms of building businesses and everything else. You might have 60, 80, 90 employees, you make 600, but then you got to give up half of it or a good portion of it. Just 400 is nothing if you're trying to build a business, small and large. I'm not talking about large corporations. I'm talking about small business, and it'll be a huge burden on these entities, from that standpoint. So I'm just telling you, if I look across Florida, a lot of these small and medium-sized businesses, yeah, they do make 600, but they don't take home 600. They take home 100, 150, 200. They leave the capital in there to grow and build their business. That's the reality about where that's at. What's your thoughts?
Well, as I said, I think the president feels it is important to tax those who are earning very high incomes at higher rates.
One big thing is 199A. Where are you at on that in terms of whether you're going to let that sunset? 199A is at 20% for a pass-through entity.
I'm not sure. I need to get back to you on that.
Yeah, well, let me know, because that's very critically important. We went for corporate rates 35 to 21, but you can't have pass-through rates at 40%. It makes no sense, because everybody's going to move to a C corp. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Doggett is recognized.
Thank you so much for your testimony today about a budget that demonstrates we can put our country on sound financial footing, reduce our deficit, and make some new investments, so long as we demand that the well-connected and large corporations pay their fair share, and that we begin to close some of the loopholes in a tax code that's so full of holes it looks like Swiss cheese. In contrast, what the chairman has been urging the Biden administration to do is to embrace an extension of all of the very inequitable Trump tax breaks that I've seen estimates would cost $3.5 trillion in additional debt. At the same time that they express all this concern about the debt, they seem to be about building more of that debt. I appreciate the fact that the president and you certainly understand the ramifications of that. They also spend a lot of time defending corporations that like to hide their profits on American sales in foreign tax havens. And I appreciate the leadership that you have shown the world at OECD and elsewhere to stop this race to the bottom. Why is it important that the United States implement fully the agreement that the European countries are already implementing to stop this global race to the bottom in corporate taxation?
Well, thank you. I believe that this race to the bottom in corporate tax rates took place over decades around the world, one jurisdiction competing with others to attract investment, and the only beneficiaries from that were really the companies themselves. Workers in all the countries where this was taking place ended up bearing more of the tax burden, and countries found it increasingly difficult to tax corporations to raise the funding that we need to support middle-class families and to invest in our country. And so stopping the race to the bottom means multinationals based in every country around the world will all face the same minimum tax. Some countries will charge more than the minimum tax we've proposed. I believe that the United States can, given the environment for business in our country, we can afford to do that, and we've proposed a minimum rate of 21%. Also, that would be in line with our proposal for the corporate alternative minimum tax.
As you know, some of the Republicans that really don't believe in taxing corporations at all have said, well, if you go above 15%, which they don't support either, and you go to a higher level, that this will reduce American competitiveness. How is it that our corporations, our multinationals, would remain competitive if they pay a rate that on their foreign profits that's higher than 15%?
Well, competitiveness really has to do with differentials in incentives across countries. And prior to Pillar 2, the United States was the only country that taxed the overseas earnings of its multinationals We have the GILTI tax. It's a lower tax rate, and it's not country by country, but our companies did just fine with that. The rest of the world had nothing. Now the rest of the world will go to a country by country 15% minimum, which would leave the United States with the lowest rate, and we can, even if we go up to 21%, the differential is substantially smaller than it was before.
Thank you. I've also heard increasing concern that we place our cleaner domestic production on a more even playing field. The fact that we are importing steel and aluminum and some other products that are made in a very dirty environment abroad. What do you think should be done about trying to see that American companies are competitive or not being subject to anti-competitive practices with this dirty production?
Well, President Biden proposed, I believe last week or the week before, to actually raise tariffs on Chinese steel. Our firms are cleaner, and China in steel suffers from tremendous overcapacity, which leads it to really sell it on fairly low prices globally, and I think it's appropriate to do that.
Thank you for your leadership.
Mr. Kelly is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, thank you for being here again and for spending so much of your life in working in this body to try and make policy that actually makes sense. That's why I still keep trying to figure out Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. The possible loss for us of almost $200 billion. What's the offset for that? So how do we replace that lost revenue? How does that work into the whole idea of this?
Well, that revenue estimate, you're referring to JCT, I believe, and that is an extreme negative case. They indicated in their analysis that the outcome overall is uncertain, and in the most likely cases, the outcome in terms of tax collections would be positive, not negative.
Well, I know that's all debatable, and I keep wondering why in the world the United States is so hell-bent on giving up market to foreign countries and saying that this isn't the best interest globally of what we want to do. I'm more interested in a very strong United States that remains the strongest country on the face of the earth, that we don't have to depend on anybody else. Now, I understand that the U.S. is going to be presented an agreement on Pillar 1 to sign in the next 2 months. So is Treasury committed to work with Congress before signing the OECD Pillar 1 agreement?
We've been in touch with Congress throughout this process. One of the things we heard from Congress on Pillar 1 is that there needed to be an opportunity for public comment. We heard that certainty around what's called Amount B that has to do with transfer pricing is very important to members of Congress, and it's something where we need to make sure we get firm commitments from other countries. We also heard from Congress that getting a very clear definition of digital service taxes, what they are and what is ruled out, all this is very important, and we agree, and those are our red lines, and it's what we're negotiating for in the final months of negotiations on Pillar 1.
And I agree with you on everything you've said, that on its best day, this whole scenario, what we're going through can be considered unbelievably complicated, and how at the end of the day, it is in the best interest of the United States. I've always thought that, we seem to be getting into a push and pull on what constitutional authority lies with which body, and the idea that somehow Congress will be the afterthought in a process that absolutely it is supposed to control. So I'm really interested, as you go forward on this, the sharing of that, all that information, I just don't understand the negotiations in the constitutional authority, and I know you can do certain things, and there's other things that you have to run through the Congress. My concern is that the Congress seems to be an afterthought now and not the main consideration when we do these negotiations. And it's like, well, this is what you gave us some authority to do, so we're going to head and do it. I just don't understand at all how we sell this to the people we represent, that somehow this is in the best interest of the United States. I still want to dwell on the fact that we have been losing market share because of policies that we've initiated, not so much that we have strong foreign competition, it's that we have weak policy when it comes to maintaining our own market share. And for whatever reason, we seem to have become a global entity as opposed to the strongest country the world has ever known, and a nation that is the first responder in everything that goes bad in the world. We're the first ones to be there, and we keep ceding off all of these different things that we have, all of these different abilities that we have. And so, no, I think it's more important to act globally right now. I would just suggest that I'm looking at the globe right now, and the globe is looking at us to see, I wonder when the Yanks are going to show up. I just hate to see us keep giving up authority and the negotiations taking place from the executive branch and then being run through the Congress at a later date. So all I'm asking you to do is commit. Like, we need to know what's going on and what's taking place. I don't like giving anybody a pen to go ahead and sign on to something in an international trade and a global tax initiative. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I think it's totally unconstitutional. And in fact, it's just not the right way to do things.
We have consulted with Congress throughout over the last 3.5 years.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you're saying.
Would need to be
It depends how, Ms. Yellen, excuse
and,
me, just to reclaim my time's up, but it depends on how you identify we've consulted with Congress. I like to be consulted before something happens, not afterwards. It happens. You guys are willing to sign on. Well, listen, thank you for your service to the country. I think it's been incredible, and thank you for being with us today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being here today. But more important, for your tremendous leadership and your steady-handedness in your position, not only now but over the years. I'd like to start by noting a couple of data points, a few data points. 15 million jobs have been created under President Biden. More Americans have health insurance than ever before. Democrats expanded child tax credit, cut child poverty by over 40% and benefited over 35 million families. The IRS is holding wealthy tax cheats accountable and has already recovered over $500 million in taxes owed. Wages are outpacing inflation, and our economy is outperforming the rest of the advanced countries around the world. And Madam Secretary, you are in large part responsible for those successes, so thank you very much. And I'd like to start with a couple of things that you mentioned in your testimony. First is the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. As you mentioned, there were a host of provisions in that bill designed to create jobs, boost renewable energy, and lower cost for consumers. Can you talk a little bit more about the implementation of the clean energy tax credits in that act? And are those incentives working? And what sort of investment are you seeing in renewable energy, manufacturing, jobs, et cetera?
Thank you. First, thank you for your kind words. So we're working around the clock to write the regulations that will provide certainty to households and businesses around the credits. We are seeing the IRA clean energy credits catalyze investment in clean energy technologies. We're concerned about our supply chains, particularly being over-reliant on China for many aspects of our clean energy, whether it's solar panels or batteries. We want to make sure that we're strengthening our supply chain. At the same time, we're creating good jobs and lowering emissions. And we're seeing many good jobs, and the wage and apprentice requirements to receive that large bonus really ensure that the jobs that are being created are good jobs. We're seeing investments in many parts of the country, especially places that are in need, whether they're areas of the country that were dependent on fossil fuels and have seen coal mines or plants close, areas that just haven't benefited from very much investment. We're especially seeing good results there. And we're making sure that people know who can benefit from this law. It has unique features that nonprofits and state and local governments can actually benefit from this law through the direct pay feature. We're working hard to make sure that potential beneficiaries understand how this can positively affect them.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to ask about 2025 and the upcoming expiration of the 2017 Republican tax bill. I appreciate the President reiterating that no one making under $400,000 a year will see a tax increase. One of the things that's been left out by my friends on the other side of the aisle in talking about this is that it wasn't paid for. Their bill was not paid for, and that by definition is inflationary. So in your view, what are some of the more responsible ways that we might offset the costs of any of the TCJA extensions?
Well, the President has proposed a very large number of raisers in his budget, and all of them could be used for this purpose. He's proposed raising the stock buyback tax, raising the corporate alternative minimum tax, enacting Pillar 2, which would bring in substantial revenues, raising, we would propose to raise the corporate income tax to 28%, still a cut relative to pre-TCJA, but substantial revenues, a billionaire's tax that would ask those extremely high-income individuals, wealthy individuals, to pay something more in line with what nurses and firefighters pay in their taxes. And there are a wealth of ideas there on how we can finance
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, first in this conversation, my basic principle is at the scale we must borrow at, we want stability. We want liquidity. You know, we don't need any hiccups out there. And if some of this is a little off, you can pass me off to staff. But first I want to touch on cash balances. And part of this is there's a couple of reports out there that basically say statutory mechanics. When the current authority for borrowing starts to run out, we should be doing an operating cash balance of around $23 billion. That seems dramatically too low. In previous years, you would run, the Treasury would, like in 2023, $600 billion cash balance.
That's right.
Today, you're running over $900 billion. This is actually more of a mechanical, technical question. Do you need us, as the Ways and Means Committee, to update any statutory authorities or mechanics of what type of operating balance do you need to maximize stability? You saw the blip we had yesterday when you did your refunding announcements, and that was only what, a $41 billion tick up for that quarter. What do we do to maximize interest rate efficiency? Do you need any additional authorities?
I don't think we need legislation. We have standing policy on operating cash balances, and I believe around $500 billion would be a normal level given the volume.
But you've been running
of our
dramatically
payments.
higher than that traditional $500-600 billion. You know, I
Well-
think in the previous quarter you were running in the mid 800s. Now you're running over 900.
I think it depends on what our flow of expenses are, can vary over time. And of course, it has ups and downs as we, tax collections are bunched around April 15th. But what caused our cash balances to run to exceptionally low levels in the past was the failure of Congress to raise the debt limit.
Well, but where I was going with that is there's a analysis that the statutory authority actually requires you to go down to $23 billion, and then that may be one of your legal team saying, okay, you have the authority to ignore that interpretation of the statute. So, look, this is not a gotcha question. This is I want to know what we can do to help maximize stability.
I'd be glad to get back to you with details on that, but I would say during my time, the major threat I've seen to our cash balance is that when Congress fails to raise the debt
trigger
ceiling
dates.
in a timely way, we have absolutely no alternative but to run down our cash balances. Otherwise, we would be unable to pay our bills.
Understood. I have a whole chart on your extraordinary measures and what's in your balances. I was just sitting here playing and I have much smarter people on staff. Like your billionaire tax. Okay, great politics. Do I read it properly in your testimony? It's a 0.01%. Okay, fine. But that works out to, over the next 10 years, on an average of 0.143% of GDP. This year, our burn rate is close to 9.6% of GDP. My fear is the politics of theatrics and the actual math. We do a crappy job telling each other the truth and telling the public the truth of the fiscal, because you gave some brilliant speeches when you were Federal Reserve Chairwoman on this type of debt future, and we're hitting numbers that we weren't supposed to hit for 10 years. When we did a quick analysis of some of the president's tax proposals, we were coming up, when we did the economic effects, of about 0.5, 0.6% of GDP. Okay, but if we're burning over 9% of GDP in borrowing, and this is in a time this year where tax receipts are up, what, 7%?
I'm not sure just how much they're up.
My fear is, as a committee, we're not telling each other the truth of the scale of the borrowing stress. We're basically, United States and China, we're consuming much of the world's available capital. Really wish we could have a more adult conversation of the scale of, this is almost hitting a dystopian levels of numbers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, welcome to the committee. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Neal and saluting, I think, what every member on this committee knows, your remarkable and incredible tenure of service to this great nation of ours. We're blessed to have you with us today. We are also blessed to have with us today another great woman who's in the audience with us today, Elsie Pasquale, and I think every member of the committee would join with me in recognizing that she gets a direct shot to heaven. Elsie, welcome here to the committee. Madam Secretary, I want to commend the Biden administration. I think Mr. Thompson went through the lists of accomplishments, et cetera, but I especially want to focus on what you have repeatedly said, that the president, and he has been rock solid on this, has said that He's not going to raise taxes on anybody who's making under $400,000. And he's also been out there as a champion of both not only protecting but preserving Social Security. And again, and let's do the reality check here by saying that people making over $400,000 ought to be paying what people making $35,000, $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 are paying. And currently, because I think this comes as a surprise to most Americans, most earning above that level pay little or nothing. Millionaires end up finishing contributing to Social Security in February. Bazillionaires and wealthy people pay little at all, or they circumvent the tax code altogether and don't pay into the nation's #1 anti-poverty program for the elderly and the #1 anti-poverty program for children. I commend President Biden for not only saying that we want to protect Social Security, but we want to expand its benefits, and we can do so by having all Americans pay their fair share. He couldn't have been clearer in his State of the Union message that this is what it's about. Of course, as you know, Madam Secretary, it's Congress that has to make these moves, and Congress hasn't done anything to enhance Social Security in more than 50 years. And talk about numbers, with 10,000 baby boomers a day becoming eligible for Social Security, it's long overdue that Congress take action. I applaud the President for doing so in such a straightforward, dramatic way and paying for it. So my brief question to you, Madam Secretary, could you discuss the importance of Social Security and why the President has adhered to making sure that we're not taxing people below $400,000?
Happy to. Every year, Social Security lifts tens of millions of seniors out of poverty. It is the federal government's most important anti-poverty program, and it's a guarantee that generations of Americans have counted on, namely after working hard throughout one's life, that you'll be able to retire with security and with dignity. And for those reasons, President Biden feels very strongly that we need to preserve the benefits and even extend the benefits of Social Security and honor the commitments that we have made to the nation's seniors. He's committed to working with Congress to protect Social Security for this generation and future generations.
I thank you, Madam Secretary, and I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being with us today, Secretary Yellen. Appreciate it. Much of our conversation today has been focused on the future of our nation's tax code, of course, as we approach the expiration of many key policies from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act next year. You know, when I think about tax policy, I think about making America the best place in the world to do business, and for that matter, the best place to work. And right now, we're in a fierce global economic, political, and strategic competition. It's not the same as after World War II. Our adversaries like China want to dominate the world markets, and they're doing that. And they want to make America and our allies dependent on key industries and supply chains. I know you know that. Keeping our tax code globally competitive is a crucial part of strengthening our domestic manufacturing base and reducing our dependence on unreliable supply chains, or those that can be used as weapons, if so desired, by our adversaries. Secretary, I know you've spoken at length about the need for de-risking. I agree with you on that. When it comes to our economic relationship with China and your desire to see more friendshoring of our critical supply chains. I also know you recently visited China, thank you for doing that, to discuss economic issues, including the massive subsidy-driven industrial overcapacity that China has built, which is distorting global markets. I'm not sure that we can always change what they do and their practices, but we can and should see what we can do to counter that. And I'm glad you focused on the risks of China than what they pose to our security. But I'm concerned that the administration's tax policy proposals would take us in exactly the wrong direction when it comes to our economic security and our national security, for that matter. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a huge step towards making our tax code globally competitive, bringing more business investment back to the United States. Since it passed, we've seen zero corporate inversions, and instead we've seen American businesses bringing back their overseas earnings to fuel investment and wage growth here in the States. So now more than ever, we need to be working together to build on that type of progress, not reverse it by imposing crippling tax hikes on American families and businesses. I believe that's exactly what will happen if we do not act to renew key provisions of the 2017 tax reform law when they expire next year. Meanwhile, the negotiators from your department representing us at the OECD are preparing to give away the U.S. tax base and allow foreign countries to impose discriminatory taxes on U.S. companies. This does not help us. Anyone who runs a business would understand that. I believe that tax increases proposed by the President's budget and the failed global tax negotiations being supported by this administration would severely harm our efforts to rebuild our domestic manufacturing and bring home critical supply chains. Secretary, the President's budget proposes increasing the corporate tax rate, so one of the highest in the world, even higher than communist China, which will make it much harder to bring manufacturing home from China, and to meet your desire to de-risk from the PRC. One example, the Chinese have a monopoly on generic medications, all the way down to the active pharmaceutical ingredients. How do we break that monopoly and reduce our health risk, our national security risk, by increasing corporate tax rates, making us unable to compete? I mean, are you against or are you for domestic supply chain production to enhance our national security and our national health security for our critical needs? Because I just don't see how increasing corporate tax rate, making us less competitive in the world, is going to bring business back to the United States where we need it most.
I certainly agree with the goal of having resilient supply chains. The idea of friendshoring means we'll work with trusted allies, and in addition to sourcing domestically. In the case of critical drugs, certainly I think that's an area where it's important that we have domestic capacity and are not totally reliant on China and other countries that may not prove dependable in the future. And there are a variety of ways to promote this.
Excuse me, though. Who are we going to depend on then? If we're increasing our corporate tax rate, that doesn't make us more competitive. And are we going to rely on our allies to reduce theirs? Is that the idea? I mean, this just makes no sense.
Well,
We've had no one leave.
I would point out that the Pillar 2 agreement does impose taxes on China that regardless of what their subsidies are or how they choose to tax, the United States and other countries that adopt Pillar 2 will have the ability to place taxes up to this minimum tax on China to try to level the playing field. So China will not gain any advantage if it chooses. It has said it will implement the deal. But if it doesn't do so, we will implement the deal on Chinese multinationals that compete with ours through a provision called the undertax payment rule.
Well, you had conversations with them. I would doubt that they said that they would cut their subsidies. I yield back.
Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary. So, unemployment is at an historic low. Interrupt me when I say something that's not correct or can't be proven by data. Wages are rising. I want to come back to that in a minute. Inflation has plummeted. We got work to do. Factories are booming. America's economy is the envy of the entire world. There's no two ways about it. So I'm proud of our efforts to make big business and rich tax cheats finally pay their fair share. What the heck is wrong with that? And we've made progress. We have not made progress in the area of the income gap that still exists, even when wages increase 4 to 5%. We've got to do something about the code, the tax code, the very tax code. You can draw a straight line from these wins to the policies enacted by President Biden. And yes, Democrats. Secretary Yellen, I'm glad the budget includes, finally, closing the carried interest loophole, maybe the worst loophole in the entire tax code. My Ending Wall Street Tax Giveaway Act mirrors your proposal to ensure Wall Street executives and private equity tycoons pay their fair share. We came very close to closing that loophole, if you remember, in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm not giving up. Because if we don't do that, we continue to send the wrong message to taxpayers. You talk about competition, that's what we need. Madam Secretary, as the Congress continues to consider future tax legislation, can you commit to making carried interest fairness a top priority?
Yes.
Question 2. Earlier this year, the GAO released a report. I requested that report on ways to crack down on wealthy tax cheats. It found that good enforcement returns $12 for every dollar spent. Remember that report. But identifying high-dollar cheating is a big challenge. They got every trick and every lawyer in the trade. As rich tax cheats use sophisticated and brazen tactics to obscure their earnings. That's nothing new over the last 45 years. Madam Secretary, can you expand on plans to address gaps in the IRS hiring, training, and tech so that the agency has the tools to close the tax gap?
The IRS is doing exactly that using the funding provided in the Inflation Reduction Act. Its budget was so limited after decades of cutting its budget as the economy grew that enforcement and the ability to hire competent tax lawyers, accountants, data scientists, and the like, that audit rates fell to exceptionally low levels on wealthy individuals, complex partnerships, and large corporations. And with the infusion of funds that the IRS has received, in addition to and importantly improving consumer service dramatically, it is going after all of those tax cheats who are responsible for what's estimated as a $7 trillion tax gap over the next decade. And it's had an early success in going after 1,000 individuals making more than $1 million who owed back taxes. It's already collected $500 million. But There's much further to go, and that's where the enforcement dollars are going. No increase, as I've promised and as the commissioner has promised, on households or small businesses earning under $400,000. It's all going to the areas that you named.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Welcome to the neighborhood, and I yield back.
Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. I want to see if you can help me understand some math, if you don't mind. With OECD proposals, joint tax said that Pillar 2 is going to cost us $120 billion in tax revenue over a 10-year period, and OECD Pillar 1 would cost us $40 billion over 10 years. This is JCT. So this is, we have to use this. So you're looking at $160 billion, probably on the conservative side, of lost revenue coming into the Treasury because we're turning that revenue over to other countries. All right, if that is the case and we're going to lose that revenue, that's one thing. But I can just point to 2 Georgia companies that will tell you that their analysis of Pillar 1 will cost them combined about $1 billion in sales. Now, if a company is going to lose $1 billion in sales, that means they're going to start cutting back, which means that it's going to put my fellow Georgians out of work. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So again, according to JCT, between Pillars 1 and 2, about $160 billion in lost revenue. Now, just laying the groundwork there. You made mention that you were going to propose or work with the president and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to raise the corporate minimum tax, AMT, the corporate tax to 28%, implement a new billionaire tax. You had a laundry list of items, correct, that you believe we should be raising taxes on. Okay. So let me ask you something. If a company owes the Treasury $200 million in taxes, and you would like to collect those taxes to help with deficit or spending, correct? But then they can turn around and write off all of that by buying green energy tax credits. How much of that money then of that $200 million is going to come into the Treasury? If I can wipe out my tax liability by buying green energy tax credits, what good does that do in coming into the Treasury?
Well, if the firm is using the transferability feature to buy these tax credits, then another company that we want to benefit from those credits, the stimulus and incentive that they offer, but that lacks sufficient tax liability. This is a way in which we provide.
But we're giving a pass to. Analysis has shown that about 90% of these tax credits are going to go to companies with over $1 billion in revenue. And again, if you're looking to bring revenue into the Treasury to pay for whatever.
Look, it's really the same thing as essentially making the tax credits refundable, which would have been an alternative.
Why would we do that? Why would we give companies like Amazon and Walmart, these major corporations, refundable credits to go spend money in the green energy sector?
Because many of the companies that are responding to the IRA and building the clean energy economy we want to see are companies that lack sufficient tax liability to be able to benefit from these tax incentives.
Wait a minute. Madam Secretary, reclaiming my time, if you're going to go down that road and you're going to say companies lack that tax liability, why are we doing it on green energy and not looking at pharmaceuticals, not looking at other technology? But bottom line, why wouldn't we just say to Amazon, okay, not to pick on them, but they are a highly profitable company. Why not just say, You've got to pay your taxes, and then you go buy a fleet of battery-powered vans if you want to. You are cutting revenues. You're giving a tax break to the very people that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are saying have to go. They want them to pay their fair share, but they're not going to pay their fair share because they're going to go down this. They're going to go down this green energy deal that absolutely undermines our competitiveness. It doesn't make sense. The math doesn't add up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Madam Secretary. Thank you for your work. Let me begin by offering my sincere appreciation to your staff who are helping my office with a number of very complex constituent issues. Your staff is top-notch, and for that I'm grateful. In addition, I thank Treasury for its effort to work collaboratively with states to identify the owners and beneficiaries of the $30 billion in unclaimed savings bonds. And I know that you cannot comment because the rule is not final, but I wanted to share concerns that Representative Estes and I and others on this committee have raised about the proposed rule. Given that most of these unclaimed bonds come from the middle of the last century, when African Americans and others were excluded from banks and often turned to Treasury bonds as a key investment, I suspect that a high percentage of unclaimed bondholders will be blacks and people of other minority group identities. Given these concerns and given the success of state treasurers at helping people find unclaimed property, I worry that the proposed rules would greatly limit the ability of states to help Americans get back their missing savings bonds. My hope is that the final rule will allow Treasury to work more collaboratively with states as we intended when we enacted the law. And finally, in my remaining time, I'd like to thank you for your hard work implementing the increased energy investment credit for solar power, especially in low-income communities, and ask if you could share any updates to this program.
Thank you very much. And on the savings bonds issue, appreciate your comments, and we'll make sure that they're adequately considered before final regs are finalized. And on the bonuses for low-income communities, we've worked hard to clarify the rules and make sure that there is, that low-income communities, that's a special focus of the IRA, to make sure that they're able to benefit, especially from the credits for solar, wind, and other renewable energies. We're working to finalize a set of regulations on this, and there are also allocated credits for low-income communities that the Department of Energy has accepted applications and awarded funds.
I thank you very much. And let me just ask, are these proven to be effective in terms of job creation?
I think overall, the data that we've amassed shows that the green energy, the green credits have been very effective at stimulating investment, resulting in job creation, and those jobs are disproportionately in lower income communities with lower college graduation rates also in rural communities and in communities that have been dependent on fossil fuel and seen job loss there.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for joining us today. As you know, last month, the inflation came in hotter than expected for the third month in a row, which is a hit to American families by itself, but it's not just a one-time impact. Inflation's cumulative, and hardworking Kansans have been suffering for 3 years now, as this chart behind me indicates. You know, since Joe Biden took office, inflation's up over 19%. Joint Economic Committee estimate that Kansans are paying an average of nearly $1,000 more per month for the same goods and services, the same food, the same clothes, the same gas, the same rent that they did in January of 2021. And since then, in total, the average Kansan household has spent $23,600 more due to inflation. At the same time, net income is down almost 4%. I know your boss and his administration like to point to rosier numbers, but the fact is, for everyday Americans, the chart behind me is the epitome of Bidenomics, and it's a complete failure. You know, several years ago, Secretary, you mentioned it and called inflation transitory. And since you said that, I think that's the wrong word, but I guess I'd like to ask you what you would call inflation now. What word would you use?
Well, inflation has come down considerably, and the consensus of thinking among economists is that it was largely due to supply shocks that are mitigating, and our inflation has been quite similar to that in other advanced countries around the world, which suggests it was due to supply shocks connected with the pandemic.
I think you'll have a difference of opinion in economists. I mean, we even had Democrat and Republican economists in 2021 talking about the extra spending that was coming, proposed by the administration, that was actually going to result in this inflation, and actually that's what we've seen. Well, you know, I think most Americans would use phrases like crippling or painful or hindering the pursuit of the American dream. In fact, my constituents tell me about the challenges they face when they fill up their cars or buy their groceries or pay the rent or mortgage. And the numbers show the pain behind me that's still continuing to increase to this day. And they're the results of Bidenomics and the policies that have been increased by the Democrats over the last 3 years.
I think Americans care.
I do also want to switch gears a little bit before I run out of time. You mentioned earlier that in a discussion with Chairman Smith that President Biden was not going to increase taxes on people making less than $400,000. In fact, I have a tweet here from Joe Biden dated 1 week ago today in talking about the Trump tax cuts. And he said, this tax cut is going to expire. If I'm reelected, it's going to stay expired. I did some quick calculations, and basically what that means is that there's going to be a 25% increase in the tax rate on people that make less than $44,000. There's going to be an additional $14,000 tax increase on people making less than $95,000, and additional increases on others up until making the $400,000. So if this tweet is right, that came from President Biden, he is going to increase taxes on people making less than $400,000.
President Biden has repeatedly issued a set of principles that will guide his negotiations, and he has repeatedly said that he will not support increases on families making under $400,000. And I haven't looked at the tweet myself.
I really want to get to one other point before we run out of time. But I can send you this tweet if you'd like to see that later after the committee. But I do want to get and talk a little bit about OECD. I know it's been brought up before, particularly Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I mean, I've stated several times in the hearing room that, in principle, Republicans and Democrats are in favor of eliminating the discriminatory digital services taxes and provide tax simplicity and consistency for businesses in the growing digital economy. However, despite the ongoing discussions, we're still seeing more and more countries like Canada enact DSTs, And the proliferation of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 has provided foreign countries the opportunity to raid our tax base. In fact, Pillar 2, as pointed out by the Joint Committee on Taxation, is going to cost the U.S. Treasury tax revenue. Pillar 2 itself, as pointed out by my colleague, Representative Ferguson, that is $120 billion. And earlier this year, JCT report on Pillar 1 note that the plurality of in-scope countries would be from the U.S., and likely that the U.S. Treasury would forego between $100 million and $4.4 billion per year in tax receipts. In fact, I recently heard from one Fortune 100 company that they'd be required to send between $100 and $500 million from the U.S. Treasury to countries like France and Germany and Japan. I think these policies that have been negotiated with OECD are dangerous for our U.S. tax base. We're already struggling to collect enough revenue, and I think we need to change course. I'm sorry I'm out of time. I'd like to talk more about this with you, but I'll yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Smucker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary. I'm over on this side. There we go. Fooled me, too. I'd like to just clarify with you for those listeners watching this today the impact of your budget on the debt. Can you tell me the current level of our debt? What's the current debt amount? It's about $34 trillion, which includes debt held by the or intergovernmental debt as well.
That's right.
And can you also tell me what the projected debt will be at the end of this budget period, at the end of 10 years?
So normally you look at debt held by the public.
Okay, we can use that number if you'd like.
Which is currently about 28 trillion.
Right.
And in 2034, under our budget, I believe it would be around 45 trillion.
Yeah.
But GDP also grows, and the ratio to GDP would be a few percentage points more than it is now.
It'd be at 128%, and now it's at 97. That's more than a few points.
No, it would be at 105% in 2034.
Debt held by the public, but it'll be a significant increase in...
It's now about 100%, so...
Yeah, now 97, it'll be about, it'd be increasing. So it'd be a significant increase in the debt.
A small increase in the debt.
Yeah, a significant increase in the debt. I want to refer also to your report on the fiscal health that came out just a month or two ago of the country. And you show that given current financial policies, including that in your budget, within 75 years, we'll just continue to see that increasing and would be at 513% or above 500% of GDP at the end of a 75-year period. You say in that report the current policy is not sustainable and the cost of delaying policy reform is significant, will make it much harder to implement changes that will affect that trajectory. Do you think that's a real threat to the country going forward?
Are you referring to the Social Security report there?
No, I'm referring to a report on the nation's fiscal health done by the U.S. Treasury, signed by you.
Okay, so we need to enact policies to make sure that the debt stays sustainable and we're on a fiscally sustainable path. And the president has proposed over $3 trillion of deficit reduction.
Let's talk about that. We've already established that the debt will increase significantly under this budget. So where do you get the $3 trillion in savings? Where does that come from?
Well,
because you're not decreasing spending.
Well, in some areas, there are spending decreases.
Not overall.
But most of it comes from additional tax revenues. Tax revenues have been...
Because we're allowing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates to expire, correct?
Partly, but...
about $2 trillion of $3 trillion. About $2 trillion. You're projecting an additional $2 trillion in revenue, and counting that towards that.
We're projecting, in addition to that, a higher corporate income tax, moving that up to 28%, putting in place Pillar 2.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record an article from the Washington Post that shows the $2 trillion and talks about that being included in the budget, and then shows a significant portion of that will be taken by families who are earning less than $400,000.
He's explicitly said that he will not agree to raise taxes for people making under $400,000.
So I think it's more important.
And that is not any proposal of his. He's not said he would allow everything to expire.
So I think it's more important
to look at... That is just wrong.
I think it's more important to look at what he's proposed rather than what he said. And very clearly, the $3 trillion in revenue, or in reduction, what you're calling a reduction in debt, includes a significant amount coming from families who are earning under $400,000 per year.
Well, that will have to be paid for.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Yellen, it's always an honor to have you here. I want to thank you for your testimony and for taking the time to answer our questions today. With you at the helm, Treasury has helped the Biden administration rebuild and strengthen our economy for the benefit of American workers and families. Together, we've made real progress in terms of lowering costs for American families, from child care to health care to housing, not to mention creating 15 million jobs on President Biden's watch. The president's latest budget shows that this administration is committed to building out a fairer, more level playing field in our tax code. We need to recalibrate our nation's tax system to drive benefits towards working families who need the most, instead of the wealthy who benefited for the most part under the TCJA. I want to hone in on a small but very powerful way that Treasury recently helped families navigate our tax system. This tax filing season, the IRS launched a key cost-saving tool with Inflation Reduction Act funding. For the first time, certain eligible taxpayers could choose to file their returns online directly with the IRS for free. More than 33,000 Californians opted into that pilot program, and it's pretty clear that Americans are hungry for an efficient, free, and direct filing option with the IRS. Because for a lot of Americans and a lot of my constituents, filing their taxes is confusing, it's frustrating, and it's time-consuming and oftentimes very expensive. Not everybody has the time or the disposable income to work with a paid tax preparer. And I think that all of our constituents can benefit greatly from a free and easy-to-use tool that helps them file accurate returns, but more importantly, make sure that they aren't leaving tax credits on the table. Secretary Yellen, I understand that the initial direct file pilot was limited in scope, and I can understand how, when you've got a pilot project, keeping it small and nimble would allow the IRS to carefully track uptake as well as the participant feedback. What has Treasury been hearing from taxpayers who actually took the opportunity to file their taxes online for free and directly with the IRS?
So what I can tell you today, we haven't completely analyzed the information, is that the pilot was very successful. There was increasing interest from taxpayers during the 5-week interval it was available, and taxpayers shared that they found direct file easy to use, completed the process in about an hour, and on average, taxpayers have been spending an average of 13 hours and $270 preparing their taxes each year. So the preliminary evidence suggests that this has been a very successful experiment.
It warms my heart to hear that. Can you talk to how the direct file can help families understand their eligibility for and their ability to claim certain tax credits like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit?
So I believe I've not been through the entire, I've seen a demonstration, but the program, I believe, walks people through those areas to make sure that they're alerted to it and understand their eligibility.
Yeah, I know that oftentimes people aren't even aware of certain tax advantages that they can claim, and the direct file helps them to understand those. I want to give you, in the last minute that I have of my time, an opportunity to respond to the somebody talked about inflation and costs going up, and unfortunately inflation is a real thing. But how does our inflation rate compare with that of most modernized countries around the world? And can you talk to the fact that if we allow certain provisions of the TCJA to expire, but keep in place other provisions, how that's going to benefit working families?
Well, with respect to inflation, inflation has come down considerably, and the measure that the Federal Reserve focuses on most over the last 12 months ran at 2.7%. But what's important to households, of course, they see that the prices of many goods they bought pre-pandemic are higher, not all, but some, is that their wages have gone up by more than that. So their purchasing power, their inflation-adjusted incomes are higher, not lower. And, for example, even this morning, we saw new data come out on the Employment Cost Index that measures compensation, and it was up in nominal terms. And in inflation-adjusted terms, it showed that over the last year, compensation on average has increased just under a percentage point for most families. So people generally are better off in spite of the price increases, but we know we have more work to do, and President Biden is very focused on areas where he can lower costs, whether it's health care premiums, household energy expenses that will come down as because of the Inflation Reduction Act, drug prices, and the like. And so this remains a concern to many households, and it's something that's a high priority, getting costs down further.
I thank you for your time. I yield back.
Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter for the record an article from Tax Notes titled Gain and Little Pain from New Bermuda Corporate Tax.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, as you might be aware, Bermuda is introducing its new corporate income tax that will take effect in 2025. Bermuda entities will be able to mark up their intangible assets to their estimated market value, and under the new law, they can amortize those assets over 10 years for tax purposes. Madam Secretary, this creation of a new deferred tax asset also results in a deferred tax expense. As you know, under general guidelines provided by the OECD for Pillar 2 that you negotiated, deferred tax expense or these amortized deductions will not trigger minimum tax liability that could be imposed by other globe participating countries. Bermuda has no intention of giving up its ability to attract business through the tax code. Other countries are adopting similar measures to maintain their status as an attractive jurisdiction at the expense of United States multinationals. We know about Singapore, we know about Ireland, the things they're doing to maintain their ability to use their tax code to lure companies there. Madam Secretary, are you concerned about the fact that Pillar 2 is creating a new tax subsidy race where countries enact Pillar 2 taxes but offset the higher tax costs with tax subsidies in the form of qualified refundable tax credits and other incentives like what Bermuda is doing?
Well, the idea of Pillar 2 is to level the playing field, and countries that refuse to raise their corporate tax rate up to the minimum, countries that participate and enact the minimum can, in effect, tax companies in tax havens that haven't done it. You've
Madam
cited an example. I'm not aware that this is something that's broad-based, but if it is, it would certainly concern me, and it's something that I'd be prepared to look into.
Well, Madam Secretary, we've all seen what Ireland has said about putting a cap on recurring revenues. We've seen what Singapore has said in refundable tax credits. We've seen what China does in direct tax payments or direct access or cash payments to their companies to be able to offset the taxable income, so that they, in effect, from the look at it, that the minimum tax level would be hit, but companies in those countries are getting subsidies through direct credits that offset that, take it backwards, where ours aren't direct. Ours are not refundable. We have to actually earn income to be able to utilize those. Question two, is this administration concerned that Pillar 2 incentivizes subsidy warfare that puts our adversaries like China at a competitive advantage?
It would concern me if it's incented that, but I'm not aware that that is broad-based at this point. And in our case, many of our tax credits, such as the green tax credits, the LIHTC credit, are being treated as refundable. As I've emphasized previously, we're working to make sure that the R&D tax credit also will be something that firms can
But Madam
benefit
Secretary, I think
from.
you just validated that countries have the ability to make certain credits refundable to offset the minimum tax that other countries or OECD can claim to. China can do it. I think you're going there, evidence the fact that they're not always transparent in what they do, since all of their companies are basically owned by the CCP. Madam Secretary, I just want to talk about, I've got a longer question here, but it pertains to the same thing. I think there's a lot of work to be done. As you know, the Republicans on the committee went to the OECD and expressed our concern and made it very clear that Pillar 2 is not going to take place under a Republican-led Ways and Means Committee. We're not going to give away our tax dollars. In fact, it's said time and time again about how many tax dollars of U.S. taxpayer dollars would go around the world, upwards of $200 billion. I know you said that was JCT's outward look, but I think it's important for everyone to know, and you know this to be certain. Corporations don't pay taxes. The people that work for the corporations, the consumers of the products of those corporations, and the owners of those corporations pay the taxes to increase pricing for whatever the commodities are. In fact, Forbes, Brookings, Tax Foundation, Cato, and many, many others have said that consumers pay 31% of the new taxes, workers pay 38% of the taxes. All of those people, for the most part, make less than $400,000 a year. So they're going, about 70% of the tax increase will be paid by people making less than $400,000 a year, some portion of that. So I think it's disingenuous, as my colleague from Pennsylvania said, to say that no one is going to pay a single cent, as outlined in the White House's conversation about policy going forward. It's just disingenuous. It's not factual, and it's not honest with the American people. One other thing that you said is that the labor participation rate was better today than it was pre-COVID. I know you selectively picked an area.
For adults.
It was 63.3% on March 2020. Today it's 62.7%. Overall workforce, when you don't have the luxury as an employer, as I did for 35 years, say, I'm only going to hire people working, you've got to be 25 years old or 54 years old.
We have an aging population, and as people retire, we know that labor force participation overall will decline over time.
Mr. Chair, you're back.
Thank you. You're good? Yeah. Okay. Ms. Chu?
Secretary Yellen, I heard your comments earlier about the success of the direct file pilot program, and I was so glad to hear why it was a success. And I especially want to have you address some things that Republicans in the private tax prep industry are saying. They are attacking the numbers of the filers, 140,000 filers, to show that the pilot was a waste of money because there are 19 million who were eligible, and that this was unnecessary. And yet, what I see is that there were a lot of obstacles to the program that the IRS was able to overcome. And actually, I would have called it a resounding success. So can you tell us why it was considered a resounding success, considering the obstacles that there were, and what considerations will go into the decision to extend the pilot?
Well, let me say that this was an experiment, and it was deliberately introduced in a phased way, starting at small scale. It was only available to most filers for 5 weeks in a subset of states that decided to participate. So for that amount of time, 140,000 people using it and expressing positive reactions to the experience, I would certainly call a success. It additionally, because it's an experiment, only relatively simple tax situations could use it. If an individual went on and it turned out they had the kind of income that wasn't incorporated into the first iteration of this program, they were directed to do something else. But this saved a lot of taxpayers, even in this first stage, a lot of money that they normally spend and a lot of time. And there was customer service available for anybody that needed it. And so overall, I believe we'll see that the experience was a very positive one.
So it was deliberately at a number that could ensure its success, actually.
That's right, to start in a phased way.
Yeah. And I want to also express appreciation because you also made it available in both English and Spanish. My district in the San Gabriel Valley includes many limited English proficient taxpayers who speak not only Spanish, but also Tagalog, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese. If the Treasury and IRS decide to renew the direct file pilot, can you talk about how it could reach more taxpayers by expanding to possibly even more languages?
Well, I'm sure that would be something that would be considered over time. There are other things that could be incorporated in addition to expanding the kinds of income and deductions that are considered. Eventually the information that the IRS gets on W-2s and other information reporting could be used to pre-populate returns, making it even easier. But these are things in the future if it's decided to continue with free file.
Secretary Yellen, also I heard you talk earlier about the proposals that the administration has to end tax breaks for the wealthy and instead restore tax credits for workers and families, like the expanded child tax credit and the earned income tax credit of the American Rescue Plan. We know about the powerful effects of these tax credits on reducing poverty, but can you talk about how these programs will impact the American economy and improve things for everybody?
Well, I mean, a very good example would be the child tax credit, which in 2021 lifted 5.3 million people, including 2.9 million children, out of poverty. We saw a 46% decline in child poverty in 2021. And this is not only beneficial to the children and their parents in the short term, but we know from many studies that when poverty is reduced for children, it redounds to their benefit over the remainder of their lives.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. There are several votes on the floor. The committee stands in recess until immediately after the conclusion of this vote series.
you.